afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the IAC 2023 annual address and the opening of the Warren Duncan exhibition at Western Sydney University. I'm Professor Jing Han, the director of the Institute for Chinese and Australian Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University. We are holding this dual event in partnership with the Whitlam Institute. I'm the MC today. I began by acknowledging that we are on the land of the Darug people whose ancestors have been traditional owners of their country for thousands of years, and pay our respect to the First Nations elders, past, present, and emerging. In a moment, the Vice-Chancellor will acknowledge our distinguished guests today in his opening speech. I would like just to say a few words in appreciation of the Vice-Chancellor's ongoing support to arts and culture and his insightful knowledge of cross-culture communication. Vice-Chancellor is a pure mathematician, and pure mathematics, and I quote, is to explore complex concepts and never before solve the problems, unquote. So it is no surprising that the Vice-Chancellor is very interested in cultural and linguistic conflicts, which feature prominently in cross-cultural communication. These cultural and linguistic conflicts, many of which are yet to be resolved, are heightened in subtitling, because subtitling, as the Vice-Chancellor has been well informed over the years by me, is controlled by three principal constraints. One, reading speed. Subtitling translates speech into reading format, and people almost always speak faster than they read. Two, limited on-screen space, and no more than 2 lines of subtitles at one time. And three, most importantly, no footnotes or endnotes in subtitling. In my recent trip to China with Vice-Chancellor, Vice-Chancellor constructed this never-before-occurred problem during our bus trip from a partner university to the airport. Vice-Chancellor said, "Jing, this is a thriller I'm making up. Right now, don't worry about the plot, which I haven't thought through. But I can tell you the key clue to identifying the killer. That lies in a remark made by the killer, which reveals unknowingly his Australian identity. So at the end of this story this guy is telling, he says, I was just running around like headless chook." Now, Vice-Chancellor continued, "Jing, how are you going to translate this into Chinese to indicate and convey the word chook as an Australian vernacular, which is the clue in your Chinese subtitle? Remember, no footnote." I thought really hard and found that in Chinese, there was no slang word for chicken. We just call a chicken a chicken. 鸡就是鸡就是鸡. We don't have other words for it. So I've been thinking of this problem since, and just came up with a solution which I haven't informed the Vice-Chancellor yet. So I would say in my Chinese translation subtitle, back translated in English, this guy says, "I was just running around like a headless chicken in Australian style." And of course, the Vice-Chancellor would point out that my translation gives away more than his original line does, which is true. Now please welcome the Vice-Chancellor and President of Western Sydney University, Professor Barney Glover, AO, to give the opening speech.
It is always fascinating to travel with Jing, and yes, we discuss subtitling an enormous amount because I am fascinated by it and trying to construct scenarios which are difficult to subtitle, and Jing always comes up with a solution. And I know I've held you up a few minutes, so I'd like to apologise up front for that. My apologies for that. It's wonderful to be here. Thanks, Jing, very, very much for your introduction. It's one of the more unusual ways I've been introduced, which is great. I'd like to begin, of course, by acknowledging that today's event is being held on the country of the Barramadical people of the Darug Nation, and to acknowledge their ancestors who have been traditional owners of their country, unceded country, for tens of thousands of years. And I also acknowledge and pay my respects to their elders past and present, and a particularly warm welcome to anyone of Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander descent who is in the room with us today. One of the really exciting projects we have underway at Western Sydney University that will come to fruition, at least the first stage of it, on the 15th of December. Keep an eye on that date. We will unveil the winning design for our Indigenous Centre of Excellence to go onto this campus here at Parramatta South at Rydalmere, located close to the Victoria Road entrance to the university. It is, I think, what we'll see. I'm excited. The Indigenous architects that are involved in the creation of the design and the competition, from the early feedback I've had, is they're doing some extraordinary things in thinking about how to design this building. It is, on scale, a significant dollars here. Now, Dola knows better than I do what's happening. But it is singularly an important moment, not just for our university, but I think it's of national significance, if not international significance. Coming off the challenges around October the 14th, it gives us an opportunity to begin a dialogue in Australia around self-determination in higher education for First Nations people. And I think this piece of infrastructure is going to be an important contribution to that journey. So I'm looking forward to it very much, and I know that we'll announce on the 15th. And I hope as many people that are here today, so interested in the arts, will be able to enjoy what will be an extraordinary design. So I'm very pleased to welcome you all here to our Parramatta South campus. Now, I am going to acknowledge the special guests. This is going to take some time because there are a lot of special guests here, but it is important for me to acknowledge them, so bear with me. Professor Claire Roberts, of course, Professor of Art History and Head of the Art History and Curatorship Program in the School of Culture and Communication at the University of Melbourne. Warren Duncan, Jay Yu, the Deputy Consul General of the Chinese Consulate General here in Sydney, Xu Yu Wang, the Cultural Consul from the Chinese Consulate General, members of the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture, of course, our Management Advisory Committee, Kevin Hopgood-Brown, I can see Kevin out there, Emeritus Professor Nick Jose, Simon Chan, Dr. Minglu Chen, Ariel Zhang, thank you so much for joining us. We have a number of our adjunct professors. I think Professor Jocelyn Che. Jocelyn, where is Jocelyn? Jump right in the front row, Jocelyn. Thank you. The first cultural counsellor at the Australian Embassy in Beijing and founding director of the Institute. Great to see you, Jocelyn. Professor Su-Ming Wong as well. One of our IAC adjunct fellows and a recipient of the University Honorary Doctorate, Dr. Wan Wei. Dr. Jean Sherman. Is Jean here? No, not yet. Hopefully Jean will be with us shortly. Joanna Capon, OAM. Peter Kay, CEO, and Helen Horsington, the Deputy CEO of the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations. Dr. Angela Lehman, the Chair of the Foundation for Australian Studies in China. Professor David Goodman, the Director of Chinese at the Chinese Studies Centre at the University of Sydney. Yvonne Preston, from the Sydney Morning Herald, China correspondent from 1975 to 1979. Katrina Cashman from the National Art School. Dr. Mabel Lee from the University of Sydney. Of course, a number of artists here. Guo Jian, Shen Zhaiwei, Dapeng Liu. Thank you for being with us. Paul Pinkowicz and Noel Shorter, the original members of the Australian table tennis delegation to visit China in 1971, in what would become the precursor to official diplomatic relations being established, of course, between Australia and China. We have a number of special guests from the Whitlam Institute. Of course, Professor John Jurians, the director, here in the front row. Kim Williams, our Deputy Chair of the Whitlam Institute Board. Catherine Dovey, one of our board members. Of course, Nick Whitlam, a former board member. I think Barry Unsworth. Is Barry here? Where are you, Barry? Thank you. The house is fabulous, Barry. Thank you very much for all you did in relation to that. It's looking good. So thank you very much. Former, of course, Premier of New South Wales, Pauline Unsworth, here with us as well. And of course, we've got a number of senior staff from the university here, so I welcome all of you. Now, today, of course, is an opportunity for me to give some opening remarks. in relation to the IAC annual address and exhibition opening, organised in partnership, as we said, with the Whitlam Institute. This year's event seeks to commemorate the 50th anniversary of the former Australian Prime Minister, Gough Whitlam's visit to China in 1973. And the importance of the 1973 visit to the establishment of Australia-China diplomatic relations continues to be recognised and was noted most recently by the Australian Prime Minister, the Honourable Anthony Albanese, when he visited Beijing earlier this month. I know I was in China 2 occasions this year, and it was certainly an important conversation point I had with our Chinese hosts. I visited most recently, of course, in late October, and as well as visiting key Chinese partner universities, I was also an invited speaker at an international transcultural studies symposium held at the Beijing Foreign Studies University. The visit demonstrated the importance and mutual benefit of international education, including the development of constructive collaborations between Australian and Chinese universities with the intent of fostering deeper understanding and knowledge of the two countries, our cultures and our peoples. Western Sydney University is proud of its long-standing commitment to global engagement, particularly in relation to our partnerships in China. Indeed, our partnerships are a key contributor to our recent global ranking success, and this year, for the second successive year, Western Sydney University was named number 1 in the world in the Times Higher Education Impact Rankings in recognition of our social, ecological and economic contribution to the achievement of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And this importantly includes SDG 17. Those of you who know your SDGs, that's the Partnerships for the Goals SDG, and that's the one that's compulsory for everyone who submits to be ranked amongst the 1,700 universities that are assessed, and we are proud to be number 1 in the world in SDG 17, and you only achieve that through incredibly strong relationships, particularly in places like China, and to see those enduring and positive relationships as well. Now, the Institute's located, of course, on this campus in one of our most ethnically diverse urban centres in Australia. The Institute is positioned as a national hub to promote and enhance arts and cultural knowledge and deeper connections between Australia and mainland China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the wider Sinosphere through open intellectual and dynamic engagement with centuries-old and emerging Chinese arts and culture in an Australian context. The IAC also plays an important role locally in contributing to and fostering a vibrant multicultural society through its community engagement activities, including the delivery of educational and inclusive arts and culture programs. I'm pleased to note that under the directorship of Professor Jing Han, the IAC has delivered a suite of distinct, innovative and impactful programs in arts and culture that develop cross-cultural knowledge and showcase the power of creativity. And whenever you travel with Professor Han in China, you realise just how extraordinary her work is, recognised now as one of the most prominent Chinese Australians over the last 40 years. But importantly, you get a real sense of the contribution she can make whenever Jing walks into a university anywhere in China to a lecture theatre full of hundreds of students interested in interpreting and translation and fascinated by subtitling, and the ensuing hour and a half, plus all of the time those students spend gathered around Jing, just demonstrates what transcultural education and outreach is all about. Jing is in every way a rock star when it comes to the university's presence in China, so we appreciate it greatly. Today's dual event, the IAC 2023 annual address and the official opening of the Warren Duncan exhibition, are the highlight of the IAC program for this year. The presence of so many distinguished guests is a testament to the significance and to the impact of those programs. Nick Whitlam will shortly open the Warren Duncan exhibition, Australians in 1970s China. However, I'd like to offer my congratulations to Warren and Jing and her team for having produced this remarkable and wonderful show. I now have the pleasure of providing a very brief introduction to our invited speaker for the IAC annual address, the highly esteemed China scholar, Professor Claire Roberts. Claire's an art historian, curator and China scholar specialising in modern and contemporary Chinese art and cultural flows between Australia and Asia. Claire was one of the first Australians to live in China following the establishment of diplomatic relations between our two countries. From 78 to 79, she studied at the Beijing Languages Institute, and then from 79 to 81, she went on to study at the prestigious Central Academy of Fine Arts in China. On her return to Australia, she continued to explore her interest in China, both professionally and academically. Between 86 and 88, Claire was curator at the Museum of Chinese Australian History in Melbourne, and then from 88 to 2010 as the senior curator of Asian decorative arts and design at the Powerhouse Museum here in Sydney. We love the Powerhouse. Claire was awarded her Master of Arts from the University of Melbourne in 87, PhD from ANU in 2006. 2009 to 10, Claire was also a research fellow at the Radcliffe Institute at Harvard University and a senior lecturer in art history at the University of Adelaide. Claire has curated a number of significant Australian Chinese art exhibitions, including New Art from China, post-Mao product at the Art Gallery of New South Wales, the Great Wall of China, a collaborative project at the National Museum of China at the Powerhouse Museum, Guan Wei's Other Histories at the Powerhouse in 2006, Go Figure, Contemporary Chinese Portraiture at the National Portrait Gallery in Canberra, Yang Zichao, Chinese Bible at the Sherman Contemporary Art Foundation in Sydney in 2015, and many others. Claire's publications include Fairweather in China, Ian Fairweather, A Life in Letters, edited by John Thompson, Photography in China, Friendship in Art, Fu Lei and Huang Binhong. Her current research explores the international context of modern and contemporary Chinese art. Claire is currently the Professor of Art History, as I said, with the School of Culture and Communication in the University of Melbourne, a Fellow of the Australian Academy of the Humanities. With that introduction, please welcome Professor Claire Roberts to give the 2023 address.
Thank you, Vice-Chancellor, for that very kind introduction. It's wonderful to be here in this beautiful campus and to see so many of you old friends and new here this afternoon. I too would like to acknowledge that we're gathered here today on the unceded lands of the Burramatigal people of the Darug Nation, and that I too pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging. It's really delightful to be part of this double billing with friend and former colleague, Warren Duncan. When Jing suggested this to me, I was really delighted and couldn't think of a better way for myself as well, to reflect on this 50-year period. So thank you, Jing, for the very kind invitation, and Warren, it's wonderful to see you here today and to see your wonderful exhibition. So the title of my talk is Parallax Vision, Understanding Chinese Art in China and Australia, 1972 to 2023. Parallax is the effect by which the position of an object appears to change when it's looked at from different positions. It's a displacement or difference in viewpoint that occurs due to the motion of the subject, what is being viewed, or both. Each of our eyes produces a slightly different view simultaneously. The overlapping fields of vision use parallax to achieve the perception of depth. In photography, when we see the subject through a viewfinder that is different from the lens of the camera, that the photograph is taken, the displacement that occurs is known as parallax error. Astronomers use the principle of parallax to measure the distance of a planet or star from Earth as it orbits the Sun, whereas philosophers and cultural theorists have used it as a metaphor to understand the nature of perception and the gaze. I take the idea of parallax as a starting point for considering the presentation and reception of Chinese arts and culture in Australia from 1972 to the present. 1972 was the year that Australia established diplomatic relations with the People's Republic of China. It's also the year that I began my study of the Chinese language, which led to my lifelong study of Chinese art and its histories. In this talk, I will be thinking through the development of my own career trajectory through curatorial and research projects. And I'll consider how the position from which we see things affects our understanding of what is seen, and reflect critically on the complex subjectivities that are inherent in intercultural and intracultural inquiry concerning China and Australia. But I wanted to start with these fantastic maps by the Flemish Jesuit mathematician and astronomer Father Ferdinand Verbiest, a missionary in China during the late 17th century. After successfully predicting the time of a lunar eclipse and calculating the path of the sun and the absolute and relative positions of the sun and other planets on a given date, Verbiest was invited to serve in the court of the Kangxi Emperor as Jesuit director of the Beijing Observatory and head of the Bureau of Mathematics. That's one for you, Barney. Among his achievements in those roles were translating works by Euclid into Manchu, authoring numerous texts in Chinese on astronomy, designing scientific instruments for the Imperial Observatory in Beijing, and producing a world map. Printed on silk with hand painting, the two hemispheres that we see here are thought to have been created around 1674, the date of Verbiest's woodblock printed full map of the world. The maps, which when hung together have the appearance of a pair of eyes rendered in 2 dimensions, visualize planet Earth. They are intended to be read as one. The maps were collected by the architect and visionary thinker Hardy Wilson during his trip to China in 1921. In Peking, Wilson became friends with and took brush and ink painting lessons from Jin Cheng, a senior leader of the Peking art world. Jin Cheng had studied law in England and travelled widely in Europe, developing a familiarity with Western art and Impressionism. He advocated combining Chinese and Western art, but his own paintings maintained a quality of classical Chinese landscape painting. The maps were likely acquired by Wilson through his connection with Jin, who was a notable collector of Chinese art. For the purpose of this talk, I couldn't resist comparing Verbiest's maps of the 2 hemispheres with these 2 retinal photographs of my own eyes taken after a visit to the optometrist Specsavers in Little Collins Street to diagnose what turned out to be an optical migraine. I'd never heard of such a thing. I was glad it wasn't a detached retina. These amazing images proved that that was not the case. Eyes are literally our windows to the world. The world is reflected back to us through them. And for hundreds and no doubt thousands of years, we humans have been curious about worlds beyond our immediate grasp. Scottish photographer and traveller John Thomson is one of the best-known photographers to have worked in China in the late 1800s. His photographs were published in deluxe volumes for English-speaking readers with titles such as Illustrations of China and Its People. With the help of unacknowledged local assistance, Thomson was able to access Chinese subjects during a time when photography was not widely understood and contact with foreigners was limited. Photographs were staged and subjects were presented to foreign readers not identified by name, but as examples of generic types. Technological limitations meant that subjects were required to remain still for a considerable period of time, resulting in images that were often rather stiff-looking. This and the previous photograph were taken with stereo cameras, cameras with 2 lenses that create 2 similar images side by side. The images are slightly different, designed to mimic human eyesight. The stereograph images would be placed in a viewing device called a stereoscope, in which overlapping fields of vision create one image that is transformed into a 3-dimensional looking image through the perception of depth. In the case of this image, taken by American photographer Milton Miller around 1861, a foreign photographer has taken a photograph of Chinese subjects, one of whom views an image through a stereoscope. We are looking at someone looking at an image, but we are unaware of what that person is looking at. As the photography scholar Roberta Wu has shown, the stereograph presents two related but very different gazes occurring at the moment the photograph was taken. The stereoscopes look like this. The one on the left is an earlier version similar to the one being used in Miller's photograph. The one on the right is a later, lighter, handheld version. Viewing stereographs was a popular parlour game in which images of exotic locations around the world were passed around and viewed in 3 dimensions. The focus was adjusted by winding the knob or moving the card along the horizontal support of the arm of the device. China was a popular subject for this form of novel armchair travel. In the 19th and early to mid-20th centuries, travel to China was still relatively difficult, making the majority of people dependent on information relayed in text and images from those privileged few who managed to get there: missionaries, officials, traders, photographers, wanderers, and journalists. An important and early figure who promoted the understanding of China to the outside world was medical doctor and wanderer turned journalist George Ernest Morrison. Born in Geelong, Morrison became the Peking-based correspondent for London's Times newspaper and later political advisor to Yuan Shikai, President of the Republic of China. Alastair Morrison, George Ernest Morrison's second son, was born in Peking in 1946. He married Hedda Hammer, a German-trained photographer who had come to China in 1933 to take up a position as manager of the German-owned Hartung's Photoshop in Peking's legation quarter. In the early 1990s, through research conducted for the commission of a new work by the contemporary Australian artist Narelle Jubilant for the Powerhouse Museum, I became aware that Hedda Morrison, the superb photographer of China in the 1930s and 40s, was in fact living down the road in Canberra. Jubilant's work, Legacies of Travel and Trade, comprised 4 petit-point embroidered renditions of black and white photographs taken by Morrison in Peking. That contact with Hedda to seek permission for Narelle to reference the photographs in her work led to a developing friendship. That led in turn to a retrospective exhibition of Hedda Morrison's photographs titled In Her View, acknowledging the particularity of Morrison's beautifully composed photographs and the choices she had made in recording aspects of life in Japanese-occupied China at that time, a period of increasing instability and change. Prior to the establishment of diplomatic relations between Australia and the People's Republic of China, various groups of individuals visited China at the invitation of Chinese government agencies. In 1956, the London-born C.P. Fitzgerald, who had come to ANU in 1949 and in 1954 was appointed founding professor of Far Eastern history, he was invited by the People's Association for Cultural Relations to lead a cultural delegation to China. Fitzgerald assembled a group of Australians well known in cultural circles. They included Leonard Cox, a neurologist, collector of Chinese ceramics, and the honorary curator of Oriental art at the National Gallery of Victoria, also a trustee. The delegation also included Arthur Penfold, a chemist and director of the Museum of Applied Arts and Sciences, later known as the Powerhouse Museum, as well as the artists William Dobell, Elaine Haxton, and Gerard Lewis. In this photograph, we see members of the delegation meeting with Premier Zhou Enlai. The possibility of sending an exhibition of Chinese art to Australia was raised during this meeting. Cox made a note to discuss the idea with his chairman and fellow trustees. With the Great Famine and the extremism of political movements that followed, it would be over a decade before the bilateral cultural program or it would be over 2 decades rather, before the bilateral cultural program could get going and art exhibitions could be sent in both directions. We'll now fast forward to the 1970s and the visit to China in early July by the leader of the opposition, Gough Whitlam, who led a Labour Party delegation to China, and his subsequent visit in 1973 as Prime Minister. And here we see 2 classic photographs documenting those visits. And Warren, I'm not sure who took the photograph on the right. Anyway, I'd love to know.
That was on his first visit.
Yeah.
As Prime Minister.
That one. The one on the right was in 1973. Yeah. I'd love to know who took that photograph. The National Archives of Australia doesn't acknowledge it. It was in 1972, when I was in my first year of secondary school at the Ivanhoe Girls' Grammar School in Melbourne, that incoming principal, Glyn France, introduced the Chinese language. Along with French, it would be a compulsory subject for the first 2 years of secondary school for all girls. Writing in the 1972 school magazine, Glyn France stated, and I quote, "Our geographic position demands that we should have a better knowledge of China. As parents and teachers in this part of the world, we surely want the coming generation to understand better than we have the cultural patterns, values, thought forms, and linguistics of Asian peoples. It could be critical for our future as a nation," end quote. The first Chinese person I met was my Chinese teacher in second year, Winnie Chang, the daughter of Mr. Zhang, who would go on to teach me at the University of Melbourne. In 1978, the opportunity arose to travel to China as a privately funded student. I'd only completed 1 year at university and was not offered a government scholarship. With the support of my parents, who were not at all wealthy, I enrolled as a private student at the Beijing Languages Institute. And the entrance you can see there on the left. The institute was located in Wudaokou in Haidian, then a rural area northwest of Beijing, today a university precinct with technology parks, luxury high-rise buildings, and lots of student accommodation. After 1 year, I moved into town to take up a place in the brush and ink painting department at the Central Academy of Fine Arts, China's elite art school. The academy was located in a lane off Wangfujing, in the past known to foreigners in China as Morrison Street, as it was where George Ernest Morrison had previously lived. The campus was close to Tiananmen Square. These are photographs that I took in the square on the 5th of April 1979, Qingmingjie, the 3rd anniversary of what was being referred to as the Tiananmen Incident, the violent dispersal of large crowds of people who had gathered on the traditional day to mourn the dead following the death of Premier Zhou Enlai. My friend and I were jostled and remonstrated for being there. Foreign observers were not welcome. Classes at the Central Academy of Fine Arts were carefully managed. Fortunately for me, though, the foreign student dormitory had not yet been built. So we lived in the same building with Chinese students and had classes with Chinese students. I was one of 3 foreign students admitted in 1979, the first formal intake of foreign students since the end of the Cultural Revolution, and 1 year after the first formal intake of Chinese students by competitive examination. Ye Tianyu, who you see on the top left, was the head of the Chinese brush and ink painting department. It was only years later that I realized he had only recently been politically rehabilitated after having spent many years in jail as a political prisoner during the Cultural Revolution. He had been a famous cartoonist and multimedia artist in Shanghai in the 1920s and 30s. Wu Zuoren is in the top right-hand corner of the screen. He had trained in oil painting in Belgium and was president of the Art Academy. In her China memoir, Jocelyn Che writes in Lodestar, China, that Wu Zuoren and his wife, Xiao Shufang, became firm friends of ours and colleagues at the embassy in Beijing. I have Jocelyn, who was by then Executive Director of the Australia-China Council, and Ross Maddock, then Cultural Counsellor at the Embassy in Beijing, to thank, I think, for the Australia-China Council Scholarship that allowed me to stay on in China for another 2 years to study brush and ink painting alongside talented students enrolled at the Academy. The curriculum involved copying historic paintings and applying what we had learnt on annual en plein air painting trips, including to Guilin and Yangshuo. In my final semester, I was invited to attend classes with the graduate students majoring in landscape painting. In this seminar, students are receiving advice from senior artists Ye Qianyu and Li Keran. While there were a good number of female students in my regular class, that was not at all the case at postgraduate level, as we can see here. Friendships forged more than 40 years ago continue today. I remain in close contact with many former classmates. WeChat is a brilliant social tool. In 2016, I attended a reunion of the class of 1978, meeting many people for the first time since 1981. It was strange and moving. Today, people are scattered all over the world, in Japan, in the United States, in the United Kingdom, Europe, and Australia. The connections established back then have carried over into my later work as a curator and an art historian. In 1992, with the support of Edmund Capon, director of the Art Gallery of New South Wales, and with a grant from the Australia Council, we were able to stage an exhibition of new art from China. The small but powerful show presented Australian audiences with what, in my view, was some of the most interesting and exciting work that was being produced by young artists at the time. 3 of the 7 artists were associated with the Central Academy of Fine Arts, Xu Bing, Lu Shengzhong, and Fang Lijun. And I included 2 female artists in the exhibition, Xu Hong and Chen Haiyan, who have since become close friends. The key works by Xu Bing and Fang Lijun that you see here on the right are now in the collection of the Queensland Art Gallery, one of the venues in the exhibition tour. Jean and Brian Sherman generously supported the catalogue, a modest but important document of the exhibition, which couldn't have happened without that support. In 2012, I had the opportunity to work again with Fang Lijun through the exhibition Go Figure, Contemporary Chinese Portraiture, drawn from the Swiss-based Uli Sig collection, then one of the largest collections of contemporary Chinese art anywhere in the world. The exhibition was held across 2 venues, the National Portrait Gallery in Canberra and Sherman Contemporary Art Foundation in Sydney. Jean Sherman had got to know Uli Sig and initiated the project. It was right at the time Sig was negotiating with M+ to acquire his collection, which is where the majority of the works are now held, M+ being in Hong Kong, the exciting new Museum of Art and Visual Culture. Xu Bing, who created this magnificent work, A Book from the Sky, is another artist with whom I have maintained contact. He has visited Australia on a number of occasions in association with the Asia-Pacific Triennial of Contemporary Art and exhibitions at the Sherman Contemporary Art Foundation and the Art Gallery of New South Wales. Xu Bing and I were students together at the Academy, and we connected over printmaking. My portfolio of art submitted for entry to the Central Academy of Fine Art included an etching and a silkscreen print created while studying art in Melbourne. My honours thesis at the University of Melbourne focused on the modern woodcut society established by Li Hua and others in Guangzhou in the 1930s. The poetic modernist works that you see on the left, dating from the mid-1930s, inspired by artists such as Picasso, Matisse and Chagall, were unlike any Chinese woodcuts that I had previously seen and pointed to an earlier history of the artists that had been suppressed. The print on the right is from the Peter Townsend collection of Chinese woodblock prints at the National Gallery of Australia and is indicative of his later works. In 1985, the National Gallery of Australia acquired a collection of some 278 woodblock prints with the support of the Australia-China Council. Again, I must thank Jocelyn Che and also Reg Little, the executive directors of the Australia-China Council, during the period of the negotiation and acquisition of this important collection. It was a visionary use of funds by the Australia-China Council. British-born Peter Townsend worked in China between 1942 and 1951, and the large collection of woodblock prints that were acquired during that time. The collection was formed by him by acquiring prints directly from exhibitions that he visited, held by the Chinese Woodcut Artists Association and directly from artists themselves. Peter Townsend founded the art magazine Australian Art Monthly Australia, later Art Monthly Australasia, in 1987, a sister magazine to Art Monthly UK, and for a decade he divided his time between London and Sydney. In 2022, the University of Melbourne, in collaboration with the National Gallery of Australia, initiated an international workshop to examine these prints, supported by a grant from the National Foundation for Australia-China Relations. Artists, curators, and art historians from Australia and China came together over a period of 2 days. Xu Bing was one of the artist participants. Also, the Sydney-based artist Wang Zhiyuan, a printmaking graduate from the Central Academy of Fine Arts, and the oil painter, also a graduate of the Central Academy of Fine Arts, Shen Jiawei, who I'm delighted to say is here today. I'm currently working with curators and collection managers at the Colgate University in the United States and at the British Museum and other institutions with significant holdings of Chinese woodblock prints from this period, in order to better understand the development of art during this time, the period prior to the establishment of the People's Republic of China. The Townsend collection contains rare works, for example by Huang Xinbo, which you see here, and I've been fortunate to work with Huang Yuan, the daughter of the artist, introduced to me by fellow academic Cai Tao, a professor of art history at the Guangzhou Academy of Fine Arts. And there are also rare works by Liu Xian, including these exquisite hand-coloured wood engravings, 2 of some 61 works by the artist in the Townsend collection. And once again, I've been working closely with the artist's daughter to establish details of the artist's life in order to better understand the significance of the works and how they were acquired by Townsend. Very quickly, I just wanted to mention the significance of Hangzhou. Hangzhou is the site of China's other really elite art academy, the Zhejiang Academy of Fine Arts. It's also the site of the Zhejiang Provincial Museum. Both of these institutions were to become extremely important for me in my study of the brush and ink painters Huang Binhong and Pan Tianshou. Pan Tianshou, whose work you see in the poster on the right, had been president of the Zhejiang Academy of Fine Arts. He died in 1971 owing to his treatment during the Cultural Revolution. His son, Pan Gongkai, who later became president of the Academy, was extremely generous and patient with me as I conducted research on his father, the art of his father. Huang Binhong had died much earlier. At the time of his death in 1955, the contents of his house and studio were bequeathed to the state. Without the generous assistance and support of the editor and scholar Wang Zhongxiu, based in Shanghai, and the Zhejiang Provincial Museum curator Luo Jianqun and registrar Cha Yongling, I would not have had access to the remarkable Huang Binhong archive housed at the Zhejiang Provincial Museum. Interestingly, the exhibition that the poster of which you see on the right, Modern Chinese Painters in the Traditional Style, held at the University of Melbourne in 1974, drew on the collections of Pierre Ryckmans and Harry Simon. The exhibition contained fine paintings by both Huang Binhong and Pan Tianshou from Pierre Ryckmans' private collection. These were 2 modern Chinese artists whose work he particularly admired. Pierre Ryckmans was the supervisor for my master's thesis on Pan Tianshou, and Professor Harry Simon was professor of Chinese at the University of Melbourne, where I was studying. The president of the Zhejiang Academy of Fine Arts in Hangzhou at the time was Xiao Feng, an oil painter who was one of an elite group of artists who had been sent to the Soviet Union for training. His daughter Xiaolu is a graduate of the Central Academy of Fine Art Preparatory School in Beijing and the Zhejiang Academy of Fine Arts in Hangzhou. At the opening of the China Avant-Garde exhibition at China's National Art Gallery in February of 1981, Xiaolu famously fired a pistol into her installation titled Dialogue. In December of 1989, in the wake of the Tiananmen massacre, Xiaolu came to Australia. Today, she is an Australian citizen. In 2019, Xiaolu's first retrospective exhibition was held at Gallery 4A. As part of that exhibition, which was curated by myself together with female artist and critic Xu Hong and the director of 4A, Michaela Tai, 4A commissioned a new work from Xiaolu to mark the 30th anniversary of her association with Australia. The durational performance that you see here, titled Tides, involved Xiaolu planting 30 bamboo poles, one for each year, into the sand at high tide at Stanwell Park Beach. Following the recent crackdown on feminist dissent in China, Xiaolu returned to Sydney, where she now currently lives and works. And next year, Xiaolu will hold a large retrospective exhibition of her work at the Bonn Women's Museum in Germany. Another artist with whom I've collaborated closely is Guan Wei, who I'm delighted to say is here tonight. He is another artist who these days is based in Sydney. Other Histories, Guan Wei's Fable for a Contemporary World, was held at the Powerhouse Museum in 2006. It was inspired by one of the museum's most intriguing objects, a stone carving of the god of longevity, which is recorded as having been recovered from the roots of a banyan tree that was removed by a Chinese road gang working in Doctor's Gully in Darwin in 1879. In the exhibition, Guan Wei played on the fiction that the figure is evidence of the Ming Dynasty Admiral Zheng He's discovery of Australia. Guan Wei unfolded his grandiose fable in a series of large mural paintings that transformed the museum's Asian gallery into a world of make-believe, incorporating objects from the museum's collection to which he assigned his own meanings. In the accompanying catalogue, there was a short story by Alexis Wright, titled "The Swift Might Speak of Its Flight If Stories Are No Longer There," in which Alexis reflected on the life of her Guangdong-born great-grandfather, Sam R. Bow, who had worked in the market gardens in Darwin before journeying on to the Gulf of Carpentaria. Had he heard the story of the discovery of the statue? With the impossibility of travelling to China during the pandemic and extending on my own work on the Scottish-born artist Ian Fairweather, who had spent extended periods of time in China and learnt the language, I've continued to develop my interest in artists working in Australia who have responded powerfully in their art to the idea and reality of Australia's location in the Asia-Pacific region. My new research project, a collaboration with colleagues at the University of Melbourne and elsewhere, is titled Artistic Meridians, Connecting Australian and Asian Arts Histories. Members of the team will explore Indigenous, Australian and Macassan connections, as well as the impact on art of travel and migration between Australia and China. We'll reflect on the position and legacy of the illustrated magazine Hemisphere and Asian Australian Monthly, which has recently been digitised by the National Library of Australia. Hemisphere, which some of you may remember, was a Commonwealth-funded magazine published between 1957 and 1984, which promoted, I guess you could say, the ideology of the Colombo Plan and the Australian government soft power politics more generally, anticipating the dismantling of the White Australia policy. The cover of the January 1974 issue of the magazine, which we see here, features an artwork by Graham Gore, who was born in China in 1948 and has resided in Australia since 1963. Today, he's represented by Simon Chan at Art Atrium. Also pictured here, as you can see, are articles about the Powerhouse Museum's God of Longevity figure, and there's also a story about the Macassan connection. They were among the large range of topics that were covered in the magazine. In 1981, John Freeland, the former chair of the Faculty of Architecture at the University of New South Wales, published an article in Hemisphere 2 on Hardy Wilson, the architect, which included a plan and elevation of Celestian, the home Wilson designed for himself in Pymble, but never built. Entry was via the porch, which led to the Phoenix panelled room, and rooms arrayed around a centrally located stone-paved courtyard inspired by the courtyard houses Wilson had experienced in Peking. Wilson's advocacy of the union of Eastern and Western thinking as he conceived it is summed up in drawings such as this, Virgin Mary Guan Yin, where an otherworldly female figure is framed by ceremonial stone gateways similar to those found at the Temple of Heaven. Wilson's thinking and approach was certainly off-piste at the time in relation to Australia's White Australia policy. Travel to China and other parts of Asia provided important artistic stimulus to many well-known 20th century Australian artists. Alison Bronowski, in her pioneering book, The Yellow Lady, Australian Impressions of Asia, published in 1992, points to the many images that were produced through artists' encounters with Asia. One of the artists whose work and writing I am examining is Sidney Nolan. He and his wife Cynthia travelled to China in summer 1965. Unable to get a visa in London or Australia, they entered via Pakistan and arrived unannounced. They had long harboured a wish to travel to China. Their journey started from Sydney. Nolan had arrived in January 1964 and the following year was awarded the second Creative Arts Fellowship at the ANU. A Sight of China, written by Cynthia Nolan and published in 1969, records their impressions of the country. Early on in the book, Nolan is quoted as saying, and I quote, "So we'll go and look at China. From there, perhaps, we'll see what sort of a country Australia really is," end quote. The Nolans arrived in Beijing with 2 cameras and a pair of binoculars. They visited expected sites such as the Great Wall and the Ming Tombs and spent hours in the Forbidden City, walking through one great courtyard after another, as Cynthia writes. China challenged Nolan, making him feel, and I quote, "less than a matchstick," end quote. His life as a painter nullified. "A revolution can have no art, only action," he observed. "I'm illuminated and blocked both in the same moment. But I won't be denied," he went on. "I'll come here. I tell you, I'll paint here." Nolan visited Australia and China again in 1972. In mid-1973, a major Nolan retrospective was held in Dublin. Included in the exhibition was the massive multi-part work Oceania, which included the series Paradise Garden, Snake and Shark, comprising some 4,000 individual works. Visitors to the exhibition were surrounded by towering walls of brilliant colour. The exhibition was organised by the Irish Arts Council and the Australian Department of External Affairs. A smaller, earlier version of Snake, which you see here, comprising 180 pictures rather than 1,620 in the large work, was commissioned for the reception hall of the new Australian Embassy in Beijing, which opened in 1973. Talking to Jocelyn just now, she said it was referred to as the Great Hall of the Australian People. The paintings, the work was displayed there until 1979, after which it was gifted by the Department of Foreign Affairs to the Lawrence Wilson Art Gallery at the University of Western Australia, where it remains today. Here is a detail of the work, paired with a documentary photograph of Prime Minister Gough Whitlam opening the installation of the mural in the embassy building, with the ambassador, Stephen Fitzgerald, and Margaret Whitlam standing to the right. During this visit by Whitlam, he held talks with the Premier Zhou Enlai, and it was agreed that henceforth there would be an annual program of cultural exchange. And here I just wanted to draw attention to the image that adorns the cover of Cynthia Nolan's book, A Sight of China, highlighting the similarities with the paintings that comprise the smaller work, Snake, Peking Mural, suggesting that this work and the method of working with multi-panels and on a massive scale had a connection with China. Indeed, an earlier name for the work appears to have been Dragon. Nolan's preparatory drawing for Snake was titled Paradise Snake, 1969. The margin contains notes including Rainbow Serpent and Initiation. There are various sources for the subject matter that have been mentioned, including ritual dances from New Guinea, where he travelled the same year he first travelled to China, and also the Rainbow Serpent in Aboriginal culture. Mary Percival Nee Boyd, who Nolan married after the tragedy of Cynthia Nolan's suicide in 1976, notes that the inspiration for the work was, and I quote, an immense ceramic mural of similar proportions. It was likely the massive polychrome glazed 9 dragons screen located in the Forbidden City in Beijing, which you see here. Sidney Nolan is said to have observed to Mary, "I can do it for the Aborigines and their rainbow serpent," end quote. In the detail that we see here on the lower image, we can see how the screen, the 9-dragon screen, comprises multiple rectangular tiles, which may have suggested the modular approach to Nolan. Nolan travelled to China again in 1978, spending time in southern China, notably in Guilin. He responded strongly to the karst mountains, recognising that historic China's painters were in fact responding intellectually and emotionally to the actual landscape. In an interview with Edmund Capon, he stated, and I quote, "They have a total experience, but they have taken that experience home somewhere, absorbed it, and then thought it. I have done precisely the same thing from a so-called expressionist point of view," end quote. In 1981, 9 of Nolan's paintings from the River Gwei series were displayed at the Art Gallery of New South Wales to accompany the Ming and Qing paintings exhibition, an important item in the bilateral cultural agreement between China and Australia. Nolan made a subsequent trip to China in 1983, travelling to the Buddhist caves at Dunhuang in Gansu province. And in 1987, 2 of his massive Chinese mountain landscapes, commissioned by the Hong Kong Land Company, were installed in the newly built One Exchange Square building. And the installation was held to coincide with the Hong Kong Festival in January of that year. 3 years earlier, the Hong Kong Land Company had acquired 14 canvases that Nolan had painted following his 1983 trip to China. Art historian T.G. Rosenthal writes that in creating his own homage to Chinese painting, these works in Hong Kong, and I quote, reveal their profound debt to the Chinese culture that he, Nolan, so admired, end quote. The book A Sight of China concludes with the following reflection by Sidney Nolan, and here I quote, "A trip to China changes you. Something happens, a very quiet thing that's got to do with the future. It's a peculiar thing, to have been where we've been and come back again, like a dream in which you drown and fly at the same time." So to conclude, I'd like to just reflect on my own experience as a student of Chinese language and art, and I still am that, and the extraordinary changes that have occurred over the past 50 years. Back in the 1970s, there were very few students of Chinese heritage in our classrooms. At Ivanhoe, we had 1 student from Taiwan studying with us for a couple of years, that's all. Today at the University of Melbourne, where I teach, the largest cohort within our community of international students are of Chinese heritage. The majority are from mainland China. It is the end of the academic year, and I've just finished teaching the second year subject, Modern and Contemporary Chinese Art. 67 students enrolled in the subject. Only 7 of the 67 students are of non-Asian heritage. While I'm concerned by the fact that so few local students are electing to take the subject, I'll end on a positive note and draw attention to the kind of teaching and critical thinking that we offer Chinese students in Australia and how many of them are thriving. One of the of the 5 top-ranked students in my subject, 3 are Chinese students. 2 of them received the highest grades. We have a responsibility to our students and ourselves to engage more fully with our international students in classrooms, on campuses, and in our lives beyond the university. We've just set up an alumni network at Melbourne for Chinese language speaking graduates from our art and curatorship programs. I admire the curiosity and the determination of our international students. There is much to learn from each other and much to share, and share we must. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Claire, for this very rich and a very touching talk and lecture and telling your journey. I just feel like we are so fortunate and so privileged to have Professor Claire Roberts to deliver IAC 2023 annual address. When I think of Claire, I can't help thinking of this very famous Chinese line, "You have to see it before I say it." 干一行行一行，一行行行行行，一行不行行行不行。If you notice that there are only 3 Chinese characters, but they have different pronunciation, and depending if they are used as a noun or verb or adverb, they have completely different meanings. So no English translation can do justice. So roughly, it means for a capable and competent person, whatever she does, she will do well. And if she does well in one field, she will do equally well in other fields. And that is Claire. So she's such a gifted language specialist, and then she's an outstanding curator, an excellent art expert, and a highly regarded art historian. And now she's inspirational researcher academic. Whatever she does, Claire turns it into a big success. Thank you, Claire. Now we move to the next part of the event, the opening of Warren Duncan exhibition, Australians in the 1970s China. We are very privileged to have Dr. Nicholas Whitlam, the son of Gough and Margaret Whitlam, to launch this very special exhibition in the commemoration of the 50th anniversary of Gough Whitlam's visit to China as the first Prime Minister of Australia in 1973. Nicholas is a renowned company director and a former banker. He has been CEO and chairman of leading Australian financial institutions. At present, he is involved in establishing the China-related Generations Fund, and apart from his business engagements, Nicholas has been deeply committed to sports, arts, and educational endeavours. He represented New South Wales and Harvard in swimming, to start with. For the 2000 Olympics, he was a member of the Sydney Olympic Games Review Committee. He chaired the Sydney Symphony Orchestra in the 1990s, and he has also chaired the Australian Graduate School of Management. Nicholas was the inaugural chair of the Whitlam Institute within the Western Sydney University. He holds degrees from the Harvard University and University of London. He has been awarded honorary doctorates by the University of New South Wales and Western Sydney University. Nicholas is also the author of multiple books, including 4 Weeks, 1 Summer, Still Standing, a memoir, and the latest, Paris, 1924. Please welcome Dr. Nicholas Whitlam to open the Warren Duncan exhibition.
Well, Jing, as you said, this is a double dip. It's a dual event. Before I move on to my particular role, which is to launch or open the exhibition, Warren Duncan's exhibition, the exhibition of Warren Duncan's photographs, I do want to thank Claire Roberts for that most erudite and thoughtful and insightful and memorable annual address for the IAC. Cultural connections are critically important, so far as I'm concerned, and I'm sure everyone here, between Australia and China. It is not just a financial or trade relationship. This event, this exhibition, is part of the 50th anniversary of the Whitlam government, 72 to 75. There are many events in this period, 50 years after 1972-75, of which this is just one. And I need hardly remind everyone that this is the 50th anniversary of my father's famous trip, first Prime Minister of Australia, to visit China as Prime Minister, and how much we, our family, celebrate the connection which President Xi invoked so kindly in the recent visit of our Prime Minister. And I quote, "In China we often say, when drinking water we should not forget those who dug the well." The Chinese people will not forget Prime Minister Whitlam for digging the well for us. That's something we certainly celebrate. It's also, I might say, the 50th anniversary of my wife and I's wedding next week. So, she's at home cooking. To show how insightful our journalist colleagues are, I recall that when we did get married 50 years ago in London, my brother Tony wore a Mao badge. Amusingly wore a Mao badge. And our insightful journalists have from time to time invoked the fact that he is a former Maoist. Anyhow, there we are. The Warren Duncan exhibition, Australians 1970s China, is timely for its historic significance and provides a wonderful opportunity for us to reflect upon the link between what happened then and where we are now in terms of engagement and bilateral relations of the two countries. For those who have viewed the exhibition, and we'll have another opportunity, and for those who are about to view it soon, it's an amazing and unique exhibition. Warren's photographs evoke a warm, intimate and nostalgic, but also refreshing atmosphere, showing what the people-to-people relations look like on multiple levels. This exhibition also shows how important a journalist's role is in terms of recording history, and we're very grateful to Warren Duncan, his journalistic talent and his camera. Warren was born in Townsville in 1944, young man. He began his long career in the media when he joined the local commercial radio station 4AY as a cadet journalist, and then moved to the ABC at Rockhampton in '65 while completing a diploma course in journalism at the University of Queensland, and he worked for several years on current affairs programs on both radio and television before moving to Sydney in 1969, where he joined the newly established national team producing the ABC radio programs AM and PM. And he was sent to Canberra as the political correspondent for AM and PM, and would remain there for almost 6 years until he was posted to Beijing in 1975 as the ABC's second foreign correspondent, following the return of its first, Paul Raphael. The next year, 1976, was a momentous time to land in China, and particularly important for Australia, in fact. First, Zhou Enlai died, you may recall, in January 1976, but then Malcolm Fraser went, the newly elected Malcolm Fraser, Prime Minister, went to China in June 1976. And it buried, at least for 40 years, the anti-China stance of the Conservative establishment in Australia. We had more than 40 years from 72, 73, when Gough opened China to Australia, until it started to turn sour with the advent of Malcolm Turnbull and his successor. And Gough was there in 1976, and we've seen a number of, and we will see a number of the photographs. And Mao died in September in 1976, an absolutely critical year. For my own part, I was working in the British Crown colony of Hong Kong in 1978 when I made my first visit to China proper. And it was very much as Warren has displayed here. There was no advertising. The only colour one saw, bright colours one saw, were the flag, occasional red badge, so red badge on a cap. Mao suits predominated, men and women, grey, dark green, navy perhaps. And as we saw in one of Claire's photographs from 1978, in Tiananmen Square, it's a long time ago, Mao Zedong shared prominence with Wah Guifeng, the now very much forgotten Wah Guifeng. So, it's my great pleasure and privilege to declare the opening of the Warren Duncan exhibition, and in so doing, I want to congratulate Warren, of course, and the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture, and the Whitlam Institute, and all its staff for putting this together. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nicholas, for this wonderful speech and really for your support. We so appreciate it. If my daughter were here, she would be thrilled to see you. She's a great fan of Gough Whitlam since she was in high school. And among many things that she admires, what Gough Whitlam has done to the nation, she misses the most free education. She's currently studying at ANU, incurring $20,000 a year student debt. Our next guest speaker is Professor Stephen Fitzgerald, AO, the first Australian ambassador to China. But very unfortunately, Stephen had a fall on Tuesday and fractured 3 of his ribs and 1 bone in the hand. But he's currently recovering at home. He has sent his huge regret and apologies to Warren, to Claire, and to all the guests here today, as he was so looking forward to the event today. However, Stephen being Stephen, he has prepared his speech and has asked me to read out his speech. Here is his speech. When Warren Duncan was assigned to Beijing by the Australian Broadcasting Corporation, it was as a foreign correspondent, not as photojournalist. But we are very lucky that he was, in fact, also a committed and highly accomplished photographer with a great eye for people moments. He captured what can now be seen as the most valuable visual record of people and events in the Australian-China connection over the time of his Beijing assignment from 1975 to 1978. The Australian community in Beijing at that time was tiny. Embassy staff and families, our foreign correspondents, a handful of students, some teachers and other foreign experts employed by the Chinese government. As a result, the correspondents were part of the Australian family and much more deeply involved, professionally and socially, with embassy people and with our official and unofficial visitors from Australia than might be the case in other places. Warren had excellent vantage point from which to observe and record the lives of Australians in Beijing at work and play. Uncommon about this collection, at least in the public domain, and what I found invaluable are the informal, almost domestic images, from candid photos of leaders and officials on state occasions to Australians relaxing in the monumental places of Chinese antiquity like the Imperial Palace, the Ming Tombs, and the Old Summer Palace. There is often a humorous or ironic edge to his visual observations. One of my favorites, which you can see, one of my favorites is of former Prime Minister Gough Whitlam in the mid-1970s, after he had been deposed and was opposition leader. His hand resting on the ancient bronze statue of a crane, his head held up like that of the crane, imposing, elegant, defiant. One thing I love about this collection is the color. A lot of the photographic record we have of that period is black and white. But here you get the color, and it makes this period seem happy and joyful, as indeed it was. An example of that is the visit to China by Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser in 1976, and I'm pleased Warren has included images of that visit. There are so many photos of Whitlam and other critical people and events in our relations with China that it's almost forgotten that Fraser's visit was also a landmark. It signaled a definitive burial of the coalition's anti-China stance and its adoption of the China policy, which Whitlam had introduced when he first won the office in 1972. You can see from the images that Fraser seems to be enjoying himself, and I can affirm that both in Beijing and when we went out west to Taiyuan and then Xinjiang, he did enjoy himself. Many, many years later, when I ran into him at a meeting, he recalled that visit and said to me, "It was fun," not the image most people had of Fraser at the time. Indeed, when I found myself sitting beside his sister-in-law on the plane sometime later, and I told her what Fraser had said to me, she responded, "Malcolm, fun?" But Warren has given us a glimpse of that. Congratulations to Warren Duncan and Professor Jing Han for this memorable exhibition. Stephen Fitzgerald. In August, our adjunct professor, Professor Suming Wang, organized a lunch meeting with me, Professor Stephen Fitzgerald, and Professor Jocelyn Che. Then the meeting led Stephen's introduction of Warren Duncan to me. In September, just a month later, Warren and I started the planning for this exhibition, selecting the images from Warren's collection of thousands of pictures from that period in all types of formats was a daunting task. Thanks to his determination and dedication, we are very pleased with what we have achieved today. Please welcome Warren Duncan to give his special speech.
Good afternoon, everyone. First, I must thank very sincerely this institute and its director, Professor Jing Han, for her enthusiasm and her patience in helping me with her staff, Sally and Yanni, to create and mount this exhibition in a very short space of time. I would like to dedicate this exhibition to the memory of a dear friend of some of us here, Mr. Ross Maddock, who served 2 terms in Beijing as a diplomat and later served as a trade commissioner in Taiwan. Sadly, he left us 4 years ago after a rapid attack of brain cancer. It is true to say that without him, many of these photos of the Chinese people would never have been taken. Ross and I lived in the same building in Chijiayuan on Chang'an, the main boulevard through what we then called Peking. It seems local people were afraid that a photograph could make them more identifiable and maybe they could be accused of something wrong. On Sundays, he would take me out around the capital and encourage me to capture ordinary people doing ordinary things, shopping, doing Tai Chi in the park, enjoying some nice food, or just watching their children play. We also travelled together around the country with visiting politicians and a major delegation of Australian media editors. You will see him in some of the photos with that delegation. He, of course, was a brilliant linguist and charmed the ordinary people. He spoke colloquial Beijinghua, he spoke colloquial Guangdonghua. So he could charm people. His own personal charm got everybody in and removed their fears. To capture these images, I mostly used the film available in those days, the best film, Kodachrome 25 ASA, which produced lovely, rich colours, which have lasted until today, as you will see. With his wonderful turn of phrase, Ross used to call my film Chiedzakron, referring to the brilliant purple colour of the piles of chiedzas, or eggplants, piled up on the side of the road, which country people would bring into the city on Sundays to sell. Thank you, Ross. We'll never forget you. The man who started all of this 50 years ago is certainly up there on the walls in this exhibition, the Honourable E.G. Whitlam. He's featured prominently in this exhibition, but you will not see him hobnobbing with Chinese leaders. I wasn't there when he did that very effectively as Prime Minister in 1973. After he left government, Mr. Whitlam and his wife came on a private tour in 1976 to visit Steve and Gay Fitzgerald. It is photos of that trip which you will see, showing a very different Gough Whitlam from the one we saw over his years in politics. But on the trip, he took a great interest in everything he saw, including birds, including the ruins of the old summer palace. Of course, their trip came to something of an abrupt end when Mrs. Whitlam and Stephen Gay Fitzgerald went on a trip to Tianjin the day before the 1976 earthquake. Early in the morning, they were shaken out of their beds in a local hotel, which partially collapsed around them. Then followed some anxious hours when they were uncontactable, and there was no news of how Tianjin had fared in the earthquake. Suddenly, Gough and Margaret were big news again in Australia because they were missing in an earthquake zone. But by late in the day, they somehow got back to Beijing and addressed a media conference. The next day, they left for home, safe and sound. When I returned to Australia in 1978, the ABC asked me to publish a book of my photographs. When it was printed, I did a whirlwind round of radio, TV and newspaper interviews. China was very big news in those days, and nobody really knew what it looked like, because there was no television coverage, no news photographs coming out of China, except those of visiting heads of state. Mr. Whitlam joined the ranks of people reviewing my book, and he wrote in the ABC's Listener magazine, 24 Hours, "Warren Duncan's words and voices became familiar to hundreds of thousands over the last decade. His skill in making a pictorial record gives a new and lasting dimension to his known talents as a reporter and interpreter of China to Australia. This is a beautiful book in every way." He was very gracious in those comments, given that we did not include any photo of him in China or any reference to him. The ABC publishing branch had decided that we should make the book internationalist, given that nobody in the world at that time had these photos. The changing of the guard and the Chinese leadership, the death of Zhou Enlai and Mao himself, and the denouncing of Mao's wife, Jiang Qing, and her radical gang members. So as a result, these images of Australians in China, that you will be able to see soon, have never been seen before, certainly not ever published. I'm very happy to be able to share them with you all today, 47 years later, and very grateful to the University of Western Sydney for inviting me to exhibit. But there's another Whitlam connection. When we decided to launch the book with a major photographic exhibition in the David Jones Gallery in Sydney in 1980, Mrs. Margaret Whitlam agreed to do the honours, which she did with grace and humour. At the entrance to the exhibition there, you'll see a photo of her with me and an ABC News executive, him clutching a copy of my book at the launch. Meanwhile, the same year that the Whitlams visited China, the new Prime Minister, Malcolm Fraser, as we've just heard, made a very significant visit. He was the first Conservative Australian leader to make an official visit to China. He was also the first foreign leader to be hosted by the new chairman of the Communist Party, Hua Guofeng, who had only just succeeded the founding chairman Mao Zedong following his death. Fraser was given a very high-level welcome and appeared to impress his hosts from his great height, as did his foreign minister Andrew Peacock, as you will see in the photographs I took of their visit. Those photographs are a long way from the frostiness of the relationship over the last couple of years. There is one wall in the exhibition which does not show Aussies, but instead shows what the Aussies met, what they saw, what they encountered when they first arrived in Beijing in 1973. For those of you who have been recently to China, including the Vice-Chancellor, these may be surprising images. The China which we met in the 70s no longer exists. Thus, these snaps have great historic value. I should say I was not accredited by the Chinese government to take official photographs or even creative or touristy ones. So I couldn't provide photographs for broadcast by the ABC. In any case, there was no way to send them out in a news-timely way. The Chedzachrome images had to be sent to Melbourne for processing and returned to me weeks later in the diplomatic bag through the embassy. So, because had they come through the mail, I would never have got them, obviously. So apparently, a black and white photo of me standing on the Great Wall was often used on ABC television screens in Australia with my voice behind it. I never saw it myself, but I was told. But at that time, I didn't just want to capture all that noise and chanting and the sea of red flags being carried at political rallies. I also wanted to capture the sheer beauty of the landscape, which outsiders had no concept of at that time. In his very generous review of my original exhibition, famed Australian photographer Max Dupain wrote in the Sydney Morning Herald, "Exquisite landscapes like Morning in the Yangtze River Gorges and the Forbidden City Moat, both in beautiful and restrained colour, carry one far away in spirit from the political and material anguish of the moment." He concluded his review with the words, "This exhibition sets out to inform and educate. It tends to transport you into the life it portrays so that in the end you wish you were actually there." It was very kind of him, but what Max couldn't have realised was that the opportunity to enjoy and capture those beautiful landscapes were very rare. All travel outside of the capital had to be applied for and approved, and that wasn't done with any speed or urgency. For example, like every other foreign correspondent, I spent my whole time in Beijing applying for permission to visit Tibet. No foreign journalist had been there since 1949. A few days before I was due to depart for home, I got a phone call from the Foreign Ministry saying, "Warren, you have applied to visit Tibet." Well, we think it is now convenient. I was completely unprepared because I was packed, ready to go home. I had to go around the foreign community begging for rolls of film, which of course were not available in China at that time to buy. Fortunately, that search was successful, and that's why you'll see quite a few photos of me in Lhasa, because it was truly a history-making trip. In those days, when we did go on official trips with the Foreign Media Corps, you had to get up early and go walking without the government officials tagging along, to get a feel for the place and also to take photographs of the normal life in that place. I remember once we were taken to Chengdu, where also no journalists had been since 1949. It was a charming place where little had changed since the revolution. Perfect for photography. I and my Sydney Morning Herald colleague, Yvonne Preston, who sadly was unable to be with us today at the last minute, we got up and went walking. In a very short time, there were streams of people following us. Those on bicycles had dismounted and walked curiously behind us, never going past. They had apparently never seen non-Chinese people before. They had apparently never seen such a tall, youngish-looking woman with blonde hair, something they associated with old age. Then, sorry, lost my bit. Acting. They obviously thought that hair could only ever be black or eventually grey. They were fascinated. Worse than that, the relatively young man walking beside her had a heavy beard. How could this be? Only old men have beards. They were puzzled, but they were happy that some different people had come to see them. It was for us a wonderful experience. So whilst this kind of trip outside the capital was greatly welcomed and enjoyed, most of the time we were stuck in Beijing, where there was no social interaction and very little professional interaction with locals either. For example, the same people worked for me throughout my time there, but I never knew anything about their families or even where they lived. Only as I was leaving after the banishment of Mao's wife and her gang did social restrictions ease slightly. I was able to take them to lunch as I was leaving, and there's a photo of them in the exhibition with me. So the foreigners, and especially we Aussies, had to make our own recreation and social life. For example, it was only the very beginning of videotapes elsewhere in the world, so we saw the occasional movie which had been received by someone from their home country and who had a video machine to play it on. There was nothing of entertainment on Chinese television and only revolutionary opera and ballet in the theatre. A few restaurants were designated foreigners only, and there were a few general restaurants where we could go, but even then we would be graciously ushered into a private room. Of course, there was a club for foreigners, the so-called Friendship Club, which fostered friendship, yes, but only between foreigners. It provided food and tennis courts for the enjoyment of foreigners only. So what did we do? I've tried to show a little of our activities in this exhibition with images of our picnics at the Ming Tombs and an Embassy Melbourne Cup party. We spent so much time at one of the 13 Ming Tombs that it was dubbed the Australian Tomb. And that's where we farewelled Ambassador Fitzgerald, as we saw up on the screen here earlier, in the Ming Tombs, with a banner strung across the tomb, farewell, warm farewell to Ambassador Fitzgerald. The embassy also established a club in the basement of the building, obviously named the Down Under Club, where we met on Friday nights with friends from other embassies and with live music provided by a group of Aussies, including Ross Maddock and his wife. The immigration officer played the drums, and a Swedish diplomat completed the lineup. No Chinese person came to the Down Under Club, as far as I know, during my time. The embassy also became our home for some weeks. After the disastrous earthquake of 1976 in Tangshan, which took the lives of an estimated 1 million people and gave the Whitlams and the Fitzgeralds a scare, the capital was put in lockdown. Electricity was turned off in our apartment blocks and we were forced to relocate to the embassy building, where we worked and slept and provided our own entertainment. You'll see that also in the photographs of how we coped during that time. It's not surprising then that people who served together in Beijing as embassy staff or journalists became friends for life. A feature of that friendship is that it is not diminished by long gaps living in different countries. When we meet, we simply pick up the conversation where we left off a few years earlier. And some who served together there are here today, after not meeting in a long time. With no entertainment on tap, entertaining became the main form of entertainment. Prized food items carried carefully from Hong Kong, sometimes in eskies, would be presented to hungry diners at dinner parties in our apartments. Fortunately, the embassy was able to organise regular shipments of Australian wine, which lubricated our dinner parties and introduced many people from other countries to the quality of our wine. Another thing that happened as China became popular in Australia was the rush of politicians to see the place. The Australian former Foreign Minister, Senator Don Willesee, was an early visitor and was hosted in true style, as was Bill Hayden a little later, who by then was opposition leader. He travelled with a small group of fellow Labor frontbenchers and visited all the popular sites. Next came the then Liberal Treasurer, Philip Lynch, who also made quite an extensive tour. Then came the high-level delegation of Australian media bosses, which I mentioned earlier, which included top representatives of the ABC, Sydney Morning Herald, Adelaide Advertiser, Melbourne Sun, News Victorial, and Women's Weekly. And you will see them exploring China in some of the photos. Then came the sporting teams. The first soccer match between China and Australia took place in Beijing that year. The Chinese sporting fans were unaccustomed to seeing their national team play against a team from another country and were not happy to see setbacks to their team on the field, and made that obvious. The stadium announcer constantly reminded the fans to remember, friendship first, competition second. We also saw the visit of Australian tennis greats Ken Rosewell and Roy Emerson, and a couple of young female players, who gave their keen young Chinese opponents some valuable lessons in high-level tennis. Of course, in the years that followed, China produced quite a few top-level players, no doubt originally inspired by the Aussies. These were all very significant encounters that were very important at the time to set the Australian identity in the minds of the Chinese people. Our Prime Minister, Mr. Albanese, has now begun the process of reviving the strength of that relationship, which we all started during our time there. And he's now hoping to rebuild that, following that very good early work that we did in the 70s. It wasn't all champagne and picnics, but those things kept us going when we weren't dealing with our demanding and often very frustrating jobs as journalists, embassy staff, and diplomats. Ladies and gentlemen, please enjoy my exhibition.
Thank you so much, Warren, for such a wonderful and interesting speech, which is not surprising to me at all, because each time we meet for the preparing exhibition, we can't stop talking because it has endless stories, so interesting. And each photo, now you're going back to see, you will see each photo has so many, tell a very rich story. I just want to say during the preparation for this exhibition, Warren had made many trips to this campus that in the end, he knows more people on this campus than I do. And then I found myself asking Warren, who is that person you were speaking to? We are very honored by the attendance of Chinese diplomats from the Chinese Consulate General Sydney today at this event to celebrate the years of connections of the two countries through arts and culture, education and people exchanges. Now please welcome the Deputy Consul General, Mr. Yu Jie, to say a few words.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, it is a great honor and pleasure for me and my colleagues to be here today. First of all, I'd like to congratulate on successfully holding the very special dual event by the Institute for Australian and Chinese Arts and Culture at Western Sydney University to commemorate the 50th anniversary of Honourable Whiteman's visit to China as the first Prime Minister of Australia in October 1973. Former Prime Minister Whiteman was the first Australian federal MP to publicly propose recognition of the People's Republic of China and the first Australian political party leader to visit China. It was under his impetus that the Australian government made the decision to establish diplomatic relations with China. And he became the first Australian Prime Minister to visit China. It fully demonstrated his foresight and political courage. Over the past 50 years, the relations between the two countries have gradually developed smoothly and have long been at the forefront of China's relations with Western countries. Exchanges and cooperation between the two countries in various fields have achieved fruitful results and brought tangible benefits to the two peoples. As we all know, recently Australian Prime Minister Anthony Albanese made his official visit to China, which, as President Xi Jinping referred, is a visit to build on the past and open up the future. President Xi had fruitful talks with Prime Minister Albanese, and the two sides reached important consensus on the stable development of China-Australian relations, closer economic and trade exchanges, and strengthening mutually beneficial cooperation. Currently, China and Australian relations stand at a new starting point for the next 50 years. We look forward to working with all walks of life to play a greater role in the improvement and the development of China and Australian relations. Today, we gathered here to recall history, inherit friendship, and try to create a future together. Event at this will definitely help foster a deeper understanding and unity between the two peoples of China and Australia. I wish to express my appreciation to Professor Claire Roberts for her long-term study and explore of Chinese arts and culture, as well as for sharing her thought-provoking perspective in her speech. I also wish to thank Mr. Wallendan for recording some of the incredible and rare historic moments of the interactions between the Chinese and Australians, which are the most valuable and exceptional. I'm sure the explanation will inspire us, provoke our thoughts, and deepen our understanding. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Yu Jie, for your very warm speech and for your best wishes and congratulations. So much appreciated. As I mentioned before, we work very closely with the Whitlam Institute, and this dual event is being held in partnership with Whitlam Institute. So I would like to invite the director of the Whitlam Institute, Professor John Juarez, to give the closing remarks. Please welcome.
Well, good evening. As Jing kindly introduced me, my name is Professor John Juarez. I'm the director of the Whitlam Institute. I'm very pleased to have been invited by Jing to offer the closing remarks, and in recognition of the wonderful contributions of our orators tonight. Professor Claire Roberts and Warren Duncan are each beneficiaries of a cultural and political awakening in Australia, attributable in significant part to Whitlam and Fraser's governments, pioneering and sustained engagement with China. Now we, in turn, are the grateful and continuing beneficiaries of their essential works, which champion these legacies. Gough Whitlam's legacy is writ large in Australian society, but nowhere has his impact been more profound than in his devotion to the intellectual and creative life and aspirations of Australians. Whitlam drew a direct link between a healthy cultural sector, national identity, and a flourishing political sphere, stating that the relation between politics and culture is real and clear. Political vigor has invariably produced intellectual and creative vigor. Claire and Warren, if I may, are proof positive of this link. The rapid elevation of cultural policy as a major area for change was well evident soon after the Whitlam government came to office in late '72. Indeed, the duumvirate gave immediate voice to pre-election commitment to the arts community to, quote, refresh, reinvigorate, and liberate Australian intellectual and cultural life. Just 6 days after the Labor victory in '72, Whitlam announced major increases in grants to the arts in every state and the ACT, and forecasted a major restructure of existing arts organizations. Similarly, reciprocal diplomatic relations and recognition between Australia and China was achieved just 19 days after the Labor election victory. While Gough Whitlam is fondly remembered as a trailblazer for normalizing Australia-China relations, Fraser was a pioneer in rendering a sense of bipartisanship in Australia's China policy. Their collective contributions created the opportunity for Claire to commence her Chinese language study in secondary school in Ivanhoe, to study language and art in Beijing between '78 and '81, and to aspire as a young student to a career as a Chinese art historian. Warren, in his book, China, a 3-year assignment, launched by Margaret Whitlam in 1980, with fresh and contemporaneous recollection wrote in the foreword, when I arrived in Peking in 1975, China was a very curious place. Yet, as often had happened in China's long and amazing history, dramatic, unplanned events took over, and an irresistible tide of change swept over the nation. Because there were no professional photographers allowed to live in China, I believed there was responsibility on those few foreigners with skill to record on film this historic period of change. Thank you, Warren, for revealing a vision of Australia in the 1970s, which was not widely seen by the world. A vision very different to the China today. On behalf of the IAC and the Whitlam Institute, I express our deepest appreciation to Nick Whitlam, Stephen Fitzgerald, who couldn't be here tonight, and the Vice Chancellor for their continuing patronage. I also would like to thank and recognize Deputy Counsel General Jay Yu and Cultural Counsel Shu Yu Wong for their generous attendance. Lastly, please join me to thank Professor Claire Roberts and Warren Duncan for their generous and reflective addresses this evening. Thank you and good evening.
Thank you, John. I always enjoy working with John, as you can see why. It's just such a pleasure. Lastly, our heartfelt thanks goes to all the keynote speakers today, and I also must give a special mention of our professional installer, Andrew Triloa, and he's here for making this exhibition superb. His impeccable professionalism and expertise that we have had the fortune to benefit from all our exhibitions has made a great difference and has given us so much confidence. So thank you, Andrew. I must also thank my team, the formidable IAC 4 Women team. Sally Bowman, Lindsay Liu, and Yanyi Liu. No task is too formidable for us. I also want to thank our PhD and master's students or volunteers today, as you can see them today, who spare their very precious time but also pain-causing thesis writing time to help out. So thank you all. And last but not least, thank you all for your support. We should now proceed back to the gallery space for light refreshments and drinks, plenty of drinks, sponsored by TWT. And you can also enjoy viewing the exhibition you have missed and socializing as well. I just want to mention, if anyone who's interested, all those photographic books, frames, they are available for collection. So if you're interested, you can ask us or ask Warren directly. So enjoy the rest of the year. Peace, love, and kindness. Thank you.